The air in the solicitor's office was a stale, quiet thing, heavy with the scent of old paper and the faint metallic tang of regret. I sat across a polished mahogany desk, the surface gleaming under the anemic light, reflecting my own weary face back at me. A colleague, sharp-suited and perpetually grim, slid a sheaf of documents my way. "Your uncle, Blake," he began, his voice a low drone, "left everything to you. Everything." That was the word, echoing in the room's oppressive stillness. My uncle, the maritime historian, had been a ghost in my life for years, a distant name whispered in family gatherings, always followed by a shrug or a sigh. Now he was gone entirely. A final, unsettling silence after a life lived on the fringes. The official report, a terse paragraph I'd skimmed days ago, mentioned only a disappearance at sea, a phrase that felt too neat, too conveniently vague for a man so meticulous. My cynicism, a well-worn cloak, settled comfortably around me. Inheritance. A quiet life. That's what I told myself I wanted. What I needed after years spent wrangling clients and budgets, shaping steel and glass into monuments of transient ambition. The lighthouse, I imagined, would be a stark, beautiful retreat, a place where the ocean's roar would drown out the incessant clamor of the city. A place to finally build something for myself, even if that something was merely a life of solitude. The journey began with a train, the landscape blurring into a monotonous smear of green and gray. Then, a ferry, its diesel breath thick and oily, cutting a churning path through slate-colored waters. The sky, a bruised purple, pressed down on the waves, each swell a muscle tensing beneath the skin of the sea. As we approached the island, it emerged from the mist like a jagged tooth, defiant and alone. No gentle slopes, no welcoming shores, just sheer rock faces carved by centuries of wind and water. And there, perched on its highest, most exposed promontory, stood the lighthouse. It was more imposing than any photograph had conveyed. A tower of weathered stone, stark against the tumultuous sky, its lantern room a glass eye gazing out at the endless churning expanse. My uncle's legacy, I thought. A colossal monument to a life I barely knew. A sense of unease, faint but persistent, pricked at the edges of my resolve. This wasn't just a quiet retreat. It was an outpost, a fortress against an unseen enemy. The island's single dock was a rickety affair, groaning under the ferry's weight. A lone figure, bundled in oilskins, waited beside a battered utility vehicle. The driver, a man whose face was a roadmap of sun and salt, offered only a curt nod as I clambered in. The narrow, winding track was barely more than a scar across the island's barren heart, ending abruptly at the lighthouse's base. The air here was different, sharper. It carried the brine of the sea, yes, but also a deeper, more ancient scent. Damp earth, decaying rock, something primal and untamed. The lighthouse keeper's cottage, nestled at the tower's foot, looked sturdy enough, its stone walls thick and unyielding. I stepped out, the wind immediately tearing at my clothes, whipping my hair across my face. The driver merely pointed towards the cottage door, then turned his vehicle, leaving me abruptly alone. The roar of the engine faded, swallowed by the wind and the relentless crash of waves against the cliffs below. Silence descended, vast and absolute, broken only by the sea's ceaseless lament. The lighthouse itself loomed over me, a silent sentinel. I ran a hand over the rough-hewn stone of the cottage. The lock on the door was old, stiff, groaning in protest as I turned the heavy brass key. Inside, the air was thick, stagnant, carrying the ghost of my uncle's presence. Dust motes danced in the slivers of light that pierced the small, grimy windows. I pulled one back from a large, sturdy table. Beneath it lay a stack of leather-bound journals, their covers worn smooth from countless hours of handling. My uncle's meticulous hand filled every page, the script tight, precise. I picked one up. My uncle's obsession, I knew, had been the island's history, its folklore, its forgotten shipwrecks. But this felt different. A low thrum vibrated through the floorboards, a sound I hadn't noticed until now. It was the lighthouse's machinery, the immense clockwork heart that drove the lamp. A steady, rhythmic pulse, like a slow, deep breath. It wasn't words, not exactly, but a suggestion of them. A sibilant sigh that seemed to curl around me. A welcome that felt more like a warning. My architect's eye saw the solid construction, the engineering marvel. But my gut, that ancient, primal part of me, registered something else entirely. The lighthouse was not just a structure. It was a living, breathing thing, and it had been waiting for me. The quiet life I sought already felt distant, replaced by a growing, unwelcome tension. The island, it seemed, had secrets, and I had just walked into their embrace. The silence of the room, after the news, had been a hollow thing, a vacuum where a life once hummed. My mind, however, kept replaying a particular unsettling image. A dim hospital hallway with no staff, machines quietly breathing. Not a place I had actually been, but a sterile, echoing corridor of the mind, a space between certainty and the vast unknown. The soft, rhythmic exhalations of unseen machinery felt like the world itself was holding its breath, waiting. It was a phantom memory, perhaps, of the cold finality that had settled over my uncle's absence, a premonition of the isolation to come, the sting of the wind. Reality, sharp and biting, returned. The ferryman, a craggy man with eyes the color of sea glass, had simply pointed. "There he is, architect. Good luck to ye." His words had been swallowed by the rising gale even as he spoke, his vessel a quickly fading smudge on the churning gray. Now only the island and I remained. The lighthouse stood sentinel, a stark, weather-beaten tower against a sky bruised purple and green. A single, thin plume of smoke curled from a chimney, a ghost of warmth in the desolate landscape. My uncle, the maritime historian, had truly chosen the edge of the world. My boots crunched on the gravel path leading to the keeper's cottage, a low-slung structure huddled at the lighthouse's base. The air tasted of brine, decaying seaweed, and something else. A faint, metallic tang that prickled at the back of my throat. The cottage door, heavy oak scarred by countless storms, yielded with a groan that seemed to sigh through the very timbers of the building. Inside, the silence was immediate, profound, broken only by the shriek of the wind rattling the panes. Books lay open, pages yellowed and dog-eared, scattered across every surface. Nautical charts, some hand-drawn, were tacked to the walls, crisscrossed with faded ink lines and indecipherable symbols. This was no mere residence. It was a sanctuary of obsession. I found his study, or what I assumed was his study, a small, cramped room dominated by a massive ink-stained desk. Here, the scent of old paper and something vaguely mineral was stronger. My uncle's presence, though absent, was palpable. A heavy cloak draped over every object. My gaze fell upon a stack of leather-bound journals, their spines worn smooth, resting beneath a brass telescope. Each cover was embossed with a single unfamiliar glyph, a coiled serpentine form that seemed to writhe even in the dim light. I picked up the topmost journal. The leather was cool, surprisingly soft, almost supple beneath my fingers. Its pages, thick and fibrous, were filled with a meticulous hand, not just text, but intricate sketches, strange, angular ship designs, patterns that resembled constellations but twisted into unsettling geometries, and more of those serpentine glyphs. The handwriting grew increasingly frantic towards the later entries, the script slanting wildly, ink bleeding into the paper as if pressed with desperate force. The light, it calls, draws them in. One entry read, the words barely legible. Another, the shifting forms, Impossible. The eyes in the deep. My rational mind, the architect's mind, rebelled. This was the rambling of a man adrift, unmoored from reality. Near the journals, nestled amidst compasses and sextants, was a peculiar device. It was a brass cylinder, no larger than my fist, with a series of tiny, intricate lenses set into its surface, and a single, heavy crystal embedded at one end. It hummed faintly when I touched it, a low, almost inaudible vibration that resonated in my palm. Outdated, yes, but for what purpose? I froze, every nerve strung taut. The old building settling? A gust of wind? But the sound had been distinct, too heavy for mere wood expansion. A flicker then, in my peripheral vision. I turned, swift, but nothing was there. Only the stable, dust-laden air. The wind outside howled, a banshee's wail making the very walls tremble. It was a trick of the light, I reasoned, my eyes adjusting to the dimness. My mind, determined to cling to logic, sought explanations. The storm was no longer gathering. It was here. I pulled out my phone, the small screen a beacon in the gloom, and tried to call the mainland. No signal. I tried again, walking to the window, then back towards the center of the room. Nothing. A dead zone. The island had truly become a solitary vessel, cut off from the world. The wind hammered against the lighthouse, a relentless assault. The ancient structure groaned and swayed, a living thing under siege. I was alone now, utterly. The faint hum of the brass device seemed to intensify, a subtle pulse against the growing cacophony of the storm. The silence, after the messenger's clipped words, had not been a void, but a peculiar pressure, heavy and cold against my skin. The image clung to me, a phantom chill, even as the ferry, a grumbling behemoth of rust and salt, churned its way back towards the island's jagged silhouette. The sea, a restless beast, mirrored my own agitated spirit. Gray swells rose and fell with a hypnotic rhythm, each crest revealing the lighthouse, a stark sentinel against the bruised sky. It seemed taller somehow, more imposing than before, its white paint less a beacon of hope and more a pallid shroud. By the time the ferry nudged the old, barnacle-encrusted dock, the wind was a keening lament, tearing at my jacket, whipping my hair into a wild disarray. Back inside the lighthouse, the thick stone walls offered a momentary respite from the storm's fury, but the quiet within was not comforting. It was a listening quiet, a held breath. I tried to dismiss the feeling, attributing it to grief, to the isolation, to the sheer strangeness of my new inheritance. I walked through the circular rooms, the spiral staircase a dizzying ascent, my footsteps echoing unnaturally loud on the flagstone floors. It was then I first heard it. A faint scuff, as if a shoe had dragged across the floorboards on the level above me. Nothing. Just the wind's low growl outside, and the rhythmic groan of the old structure settling. It would have its noises. Later, as twilight bled into a deep, starless night, the light itself began to play tricks. I was in the main living chamber, attempting to ignite the old oil lamp my uncle had used, when the electric bulbs, which had been burning steadily, flickered. The room plunged into a momentary gloom, then flared back to full brightness, leaving phantom afterimages dancing in my vision. I frowned, inspecting the wiring near the wall. Old infrastructure, I reasoned, susceptible to power fluctuations during a storm. The island's grid was notoriously unreliable. But then it happened again. And again. I found myself anticipating them, my eyes darting towards the ceiling fixtures, my jaw clenched. But they grew clearer, or perhaps my ears grew more attuned to their insidious cadence. They were not words, not precisely, but a low, sibilant murmur, like dry leaves skittering across stone, or the hiss of steam escaping a cracked pipe. They seemed to coil around the edges of my hearing, always just out of reach, always just beyond comprehension. My logical mind, that precise instrument of architectural design, struggled to find purchase. Faulty wiring, old pipes, the wind. These were the explanations I clung to, desperate anchors against the rising tide of unease. They were not random occurrences. They felt observed, as if something watched my reactions, testing the limits of my composure. I retreated to my uncle's study, the room still smelling faintly of pipe tobacco and dust motes. The stack of leather-bound journals sat on the desk, a silent accusation. My uncle, the rational historian, the meticulous chronicler. He would have explanations. He must have had them. I picked up the topmost volume, its cover worn smooth by countless hours of handling. The early entries were mundane enough. Weather observations, notes on local fishing practices, architectural sketches of the lighthouse. But then a shift, a subtle change in tone, a hesitant exploration of the inexplicable. November 14th, I read, my voice a dry rasp in the quiet room, and a peculiar sense of, not solitude, but presence, as if one were never truly alone in this tower. My breath hitched. My eyes scanned further down the page. December 3rd, the light flickers again. No discernible cause. The old mechanisms are sound. Perhaps a trick of the eye. Or a different kind of current, unseen, unfelt, save for its effect on the light itself. A different kind of current. My uncle, the pragmatic historian, had also experienced these things. He had tried to rationalize, just as I had. But unlike me, he had kept meticulous records of his growing unease. Not truly alone at all. The storm outside had dwindled to a sullen moan, but the air within the lighthouse felt thick, heavy with an unspoken presence. Every creak of the old structure, every whisper of the wind through the lantern room above, sharpened my nerves to a brittle edge. My breath plumed faintly before me. I pulled my sweater tighter, dismissing it as the lighthouse's inherent draftiness. But then, the oil lamp, which had burned steadily for hours, flickered. Not a natural sputter, but a violent, impossible shudder, as if a great lung had exhaled directly upon its flame. My gaze darted to the window, but the glass was opaque with the night's residual spray. No external gust could have caused such a disturbance. I gripped the edge of the heavy oak desk, my knuckles white. It flowed, a liquid, formless stain against the already dim light, towards me. It had no discernible shape, no features, yet its movement was deliberate, purposeful. My heart lurched, a frantic drumbeat against my ribs. My mind screamed for logic, for an explanation. Faulty wiring, an optical illusion, the fatigue of endless nights. But my eyes saw only the impossible, the encroaching nullity. The edges of the room began to waver. The familiar timber walls, the stacks of books, the very lamp on the desk seemed to ripple like water. A profound disorientation seized me, a sickening lurch in my stomach. The air became thick, metallic, tasting of rust and something ancient. For a disorienting, horrifying moment, I was no longer in the lighthouse. It was a place of waiting, of lingering, and of quiet despair. A profound sense of loss, of something irrevocably taken, washed over me. Then, as suddenly as it appeared, the hallucination fractured. The sterile hallway dissolved into shimmering air, and I was back in the study, gasping, my hands still clamped to the desk. The oil lamp still flickered, but no longer violently. It was unambiguous. It was real. My cynicism, my rational mind, fractured under the weight of the experience. This was not fatigue. This was not the sea playing tricks. Something was here, something malevolent. I would not be another victim of this island's grim history. I needed answers, and they lay within my uncle's obsessive records. I shoved aside the current journal and snatched up another, its leather cover worn smooth. Hours bled into a seamless blur of frenzied reading. He had compiled tales from the oldest islanders, accounts whispered in hushed tones over generations. He spoke of the shadow of the light, an entity said to haunt these waters, drawn to the beacon's lonely vigil. It lured ships onto rocks by distorting the lighthouse beam, twisting its comforting glow into a deceptive lure. It was blamed for the inexplicable disappearances of sailors, their vessels found adrift and empty, and for the sudden, profound madness that often afflicted solitary keepers. He had initially sought to debunk these legends, to find logical explanations for every shipwreck, every lost soul. He spoke of patterns, of cycles tied to the lunar phases and the harshest storms. He theorized that the entity fed not just on light, but on the fear and isolation it cultivated, growing stronger with each lost ship, each tormented mind. A knot tightened in my gut. The lighthouse, once a symbol of guidance and safety, transformed in my mind into a predatory trap. And I, Blake, the cynical architect seeking solace, had walked willingly into its maw. And now I was its newest unwitting recruit. The sullen moan of the storm outside had dwindled, yet the air within the lighthouse remained thick, heavy with an unspoken presence. I sat hunched over the journals, the blurred ink of my uncle's careful script seeming to writhe on the page, a testament to a growing unease that now mirrored my own. My fingers, stained with lamp oil and old dust, traced the frantic lines. He had been close to something, too close, and now I was inheriting not just his property, but his dread. A low thrum began, not from the storm, but from the ancient mechanisms of the lighthouse itself. It was a sound I hadn't noticed before, a deep, resonant vibration that seemed to emanate from the very stone beneath my feet. The single bulb hanging above my head flickered, momentarily plunging the page into deeper shadow before returning with a weak, hesitant glow. It was not the wind, nor the creak of old wood. It was a dry, papery rustle, like forgotten leaves skittering across a vast, empty floor, just at the edge of my hearing. I strained, my breath catching in my throat, but it dissolved into the background hum. My heart, a drum against my ribs, quickened its rhythm. I told myself it was fatigue, the isolated quiet playing tricks on my overactive architect's mind. But the conviction felt brittle, a thin veneer over a rising certainty. I pushed away from the table, the old chair scraping a protest against the stone floor. The hum intensified, a deeper, more insistent pulse. I walked to the main door, the heavy iron reinforced with stout bolts. My hand reached for the latch, intending to test its security, to assure myself of my own confinement. But as my fingers grazed the cold metal, a sharp, metallic screech echoed from above, followed by a dull, grinding halt. This was not a power outage. This was deliberate. But the silence wasn't complete. From the intricate gears and polished brass, I heard a faint rhythmic clink, 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 like a tiny hammer striking metal, working with a meticulous, unnatural precision. It sounded as if something unseen was methodically dismantling the very heart of the lighthouse. The ink was thicker here, the words pressed deeper into the paper. It feeds on light, not merely the lamp's glow, but the inner luminescence. Hope, reason, sanity. It draws strength from the very act of seeking, of striving against the gloom. It was a devourer of the self, a parasite that grew fat on the very things that made me human. And now, it was actively working. I moved to the generator panel, my fingers fumbling with the heavy lever. It was stuck, jammed tight. I pulled harder, gritting my teeth, but it refused to budge. The hum from the lighthouse's core shifted, growing louder, more resonant, like a vast hidden engine revving. A flicker of movement in my peripheral vision. I spun around, my heart leaping into my throat. Nothing. Just the vast, unlit lens, reflecting the dim emergency lamp I had brought. And whatever was here, it was learning. It was adapting to my presence, to my fear. My uncle's last entry, scrawled almost illegibly at the bottom of the page, seemed to scream its warning. It mimics, it learns. The storms outside had cut me off from the world, but the entity within was closing the real trap. I was isolated, my escape route sealed. The very mechanisms I needed to survive now turned against me. And with each beat of my panicked heart, I could feel it growing stronger. A silent, ravenous presence feasting on the diminishing light within me. The determined architect, so sure of his reason, felt the first cracks appear in the fortress of his mind. The panicked thrum in my chest was a frantic drum, echoing the storm's relentless assault on the lighthouse walls. My sanctuary, my inheritance, had become the most elaborate, most insidious trap imaginable. The entity, a silent predator woven from the very fabric of the island's dread, was tightening its unseen snare. Escape was no longer a hope, but a desperate singular command echoing in the hollow chambers of my skull. I had spent the last agonizing hours poring over my uncle's fragmented journals, searching for any weakness, any forgotten mechanism, any desperate measure against the encroaching horror. His scrawled entries, once maddeningly cryptic, now pulsed with a terrible clarity. He had been trying to starve it, to cut off its feed, to deny it the very light it craved. And in his final, desperate gambit, he had tried to turn the lighthouse's own power against it. The journals hinted at the entity's vulnerability to focused, overwhelming illumination, a paradox given its hunger for the light it distorted. It was a gamble, a last throw of the dice, but the alternative was a slow, suffocating descent into oblivion. With a grim resolve, I ascended the spiral stairs, the iron steps groaning beneath my weight, each creak a prelude to the unknown. I reached the lantern room, the colossal lens staring out at the tempest-tossed sea like a cyclops' eye. It was here, I knew, waiting. The emergency mechanism was an ancient beast, stiff with disuse. I pulled, grunting with effort, the metal biting into my palms. A low, grinding groan vibrated through the floorboards, a sound that seemed to come from the very bones of the structure. The air crackled, not with electricity, but with an unnatural tension. Then, a sudden disorienting lurch. The walls were a faded institutional green, the floor a linoleum maze. It had shown me a glimpse of another kind of prison, another kind of isolation. It could twist my very senses, conjure nightmares from the deepest recesses of my mind. But I had to push through. With renewed, desperate strength, I forced the last lever into place. With a high-pitched whine, the massive lens began to swivel, focusing its powerful beam not outward, but directly into the center of the lantern room. The air shrieked, a sound like tearing fabric, like stone grinding on bone. And then it appeared. A guttural, formless roar tore through the lantern room, a sound that vibrated in my teeth, in my very bones, a sound of pure, ancient agony and rage. I thought, for a fleeting, triumphant moment, that I had it. But then, the light flickered. The beam wavered, stuttered, and then, with a deafening crack, the massive lens housing shattered. Shards of thick glass exploded inward, propelled by an unseen force. A searing pain blossomed in my arm as a jagged piece tore into my flesh, spraying warm blood across the cold floor. The entity, though wounded, was not vanquished. Its form, though less defined without the concentrated light, still pulsed in the gloom, a vast malevolent presence. It had not recoiled. It had attacked. It had learned. It had adapted. I stumbled back, clutching my bleeding arm, the pain a raw, searing reminder of my failure. The emergency light was broken, the lens destroyed. My escape route, my desperate gambit, had failed spectacularly. The lighthouse was a ruin, and I, its sole occupant, was wounded, trapped, and utterly alone. The storm still raged outside, but the real prison was within, and its keeper had just demonstrated its terrible, intelligent power. I needed answers, a new weapon. Back in my uncle's study, I tore through the remaining journals, my fingers slick with my own blood. It spoke of a desperate final measure, a ritual so dangerous, so steeped in forgotten lore, that even his cynical notes carried a tremor of fear. It detailed an ancient, forbidden method to bind the entity, not to destroy it, but to imprison it within the very source of its power, the light itself. It required a sacrifice, a binding, and a terrifying, intricate manipulation of the lighthouse's core mechanisms, a ritual that risked not only my sanity but my very soul. A desperate final measure indeed, one that could either save me or damn me to an eternity of torment alongside the creature I sought to defeat. I felt its chill seep into my bones, a cold that surpassed the ocean's spray, a cold that whispered of fathomless depths and forgotten things. My vision wavered, the edges of the room blurring into a gray smear. Then the world shifted. The walls, a pale, sterile green, stretched into an endless, empty corridor. No footsteps, no voices, just the mechanical sigh and hiss of unseen apparatus. A rhythmic, unsettling respiration that felt like a phantom lung working beside me. Despair, a heavy, suffocating blanket settled over me. A sudden, sharp clang, distant yet jarring, tore through the artificial quiet. The rhythmic breathing of the machine stuttered, and the antiseptic smell evaporated, replaced by the damp, briny air of the lighthouse. My eyes snapped open, blinking against the gloom. I was not in an endless corridor. I was slumped against the cold stone of the lighthouse's winding stairwell, the heavy journal still pressed against my chest. The storm still raged, its fury a tangible weight against the ancient walls, the wind a banshee's wail outside the thick glass. My fingers, stiff and aching, fumbled with the journal. My uncle's meticulous script, usually a source of dry historical fact, now seemed to pulse with a frantic energy in the flickering lantern light. I had been sifting through the last few entries, the ones scrawled in a hand that grew increasingly erratic, smeared with what I hoped was only seawater. He had been close to something, to it, in those final days. The storm's crescendo was a constant, deafening roar, a fitting accompaniment to my internal chaos. They were geometric, angular, almost like broken fragments of a star, surrounding a central, elongated oval. My uncle's hand had trembled, but his intent was clear. He had drawn a detailed, complex pattern, an intricate weaving of lines that seemed to contain and repel the earlier broken star symbols. Beneath it, in bolder, more deliberate strokes, he had written, "It thrives on the absence, Blake. To repel it, one must not simply bring light, but create an unlight. A barrier woven from the very essence of its opposite. The ancient sailors, they knew. The lens, it can be attuned. The prism can be reversed. It despises its own reflection, its own hunger made manifest and contained." My breath caught in my throat. The words were cryptic, bordering on madness, yet a strange clarity bloomed in my mind. It was about twisting its purpose, turning its very nature against the entity. A weakness, not a physical weapon, but a conceptual one, a reversal of its very being. There was a chance, a terrifying, improbable chance. The unlight, the contained void. The words echoed, not as a whisper in the storm, but as a blueprint etched onto my very bones. My uncle, in his final frenzied scrawl, had not sought to amplify the beacon, but to weaponize it, to forge a counterforce from its opposing nature. The A. It was an inversion, a reversal of polarity, a twisting of the very spectrum into something alien, yet tethered to the lighthouse's ancient heart. My cynicism, usually a thick shield, had cracked, letting in a cold, hard certainty. There was no escape, only this. My hands, though raw and aching, moved with a newfound precision. The journal, now a sacred text, lay open on the navigation table, its pages brittle beneath the flickering lantern light. I traced the crude diagrams, the frantic annotations. It wasn't about a new bulb, but a new purpose for the old light. I needed specific tools, specific components. Some I knew were still tucked away in the lighthouse's forgotten nooks. Others I would have to improvise or adapt from the ancient machinery. My focus was singular, absolute. As I reached the base, where the massive counterweights usually hung, a strange shimmer caught my eye. The familiar rough-hewn stone of the lighthouse wall seemed to waver, softening at its edges, losing its defiant solidity. A low, rhythmic hum began. Not the wind, not the machinery, but something deeper, more resonant. A sound that seemed to vibrate within my own chest. The air, which had been thick with the scent of salt and damp stone, now carried a faint, sterile tang, metallic and clean, utterly alien to this place. I blinked, my eyes struggling to reconcile the shifting reality. The hum grew louder, a chorus of quiet, mechanical breaths, like slumbering giants. The rhythmic thump hiss of unseen apparatus echoed from behind closed doors. Each beat a slow, deliberate measure of time. A pervasive metallic tang, sharp and clean, prickled my nose. This wasn't a memory, not a dream. Where was the storm? Where was the roar of the sea? My architectural mind, trained to dissect and understand physical spaces, rebelled against this impossible shift. This wasn't right. My hands, still grimy from the lighthouse's dust, felt out of place against the sterile air. I squeezed my eyes shut, willing the illusion to break, to shatter like glass. I focused on the feel of the lighthouse, the vibration of the stone, the smell of brine and rust. When I opened them again, the hallway persisted. It wasn't just physical, it was psychological. It wanted to disorient me, to break my will, to make me forget my purpose. A flicker of movement at the far end of the hallway. It wasn't moving towards me, but away, as if beckoning me deeper into the false reality. This was a lure, a trap. I had to resist. I forced myself to remember the journal, the diagram of the bronze gear, the specific torque wrench I needed. I visualized its shape, its weight, the cool metal in my hand. I clamped my jaw, my resolve hardening. The linoleum felt unnervingly soft under my boots. The machines breathed their quiet, insidious rhythm. I ignored it all, my mind locked onto the image of the lighthouse, its stone, its light, its furious purpose. I pushed through the suffocating presence, through the sickly yellow light, through the pervasive metallic scent that threatened to overwhelm my senses. And then, with a jarring snap, the illusion fractured. The pale green walls rippled, dissolved into the rough, damp stone. The sterile tang vanished, replaced by the bracing bite of salt. My heart still hammered, but it was a different beat now. A frantic, furious drum of survival. The entity had shown its hand. It was real, it was powerful, and it would fight me at every turn. But I had seen its trick, and I had broken free. My resolve, instead of crumbling, had solidified into something sharp and dangerous. The bronze gear, though still locked away, now felt within my grasp. I could not. The unlight awaited. The final storm did not merely rage, it screamed. It was a beast of wind and water, clawing at the lighthouse, trying to tear it from its granite roots. Each gust was a physical blow, each wave a concussive roar that vibrated through the very core of the tower. Within its maelstrom, I moved with a strange, unnerving calm. A stillness carved out of the chaos. The unlight, the contained void. My uncle's words were no longer cryptic whispers, but the very blueprint of my desperate design. The A. It shimmered in the periphery of my mind's eye, a single, stark glyph amidst the frantic scrawl of his final journal entries. Not a letter, I realize now, but a diagram. A representation of a specific refraction, an engineered aberration in the light's purity. The entity fed on isolation, on fear, on the light itself, but perhaps not this light. Not a light that bit back. My hands, though scarred and raw from days of toil, moved with the precision of an architect finally understanding his client's most arcane request. I had spent hours poring over the corroded diagrams, tracing the faded lines of modifications etched into the very structure of the lamp mechanism. It was not about power, but about nuance. About introducing a subtle, almost imperceptible distortion into the lens array, a calculated impurity. The main lens, a colossal eye, pulsed with its familiar, comforting rhythm, casting its broad sweep across the churning, ink-black ocean. But comfort was a luxury I could no longer afford. I worked quickly, my breath misting in the frigid air, the storm's fury a constant percussion against the glass. As the final adjustment clicked into place, a subtle shift rippled through the air. The light, still bright, still piercing, now possessed a different quality. It felt discordant, like a note held just slightly off-key. It wasn't weaker, but wrong. It was a light designed to repel, to sicken, to burn, not with warmth, but with an alien chill. It was the unlight made manifest. A sudden, profound silence descended, not outside, but within the lighthouse. The storm's roar, which had been a constant companion, abruptly ceased to register. My own heartbeat, a frantic drum a moment before, seemed to vanish. A suffocating pressure settled over me, thick and cloying, like breathing through wet wool. The air grew heavy, static-charged, raising the fine hairs on my arms. They detached from the corners of the room, elongating, stretching into impossible forms. The comforting glow of the beacon, now subtly warped, seemed to push them back, but only barely. It was drawing near, summoned by the perverse beacon, drawn by the challenge. A wave of profound disorientation washed over me. The solid floor of the lantern room seemed to undulate, the metal railings bending like reeds. My vision blurred, the glass of the lens melting into a shimmering haze. For a terrifying, fleeting moment, the roar of the storm was replaced by the low, steady hum of unseen machines. I stumbled, my hand instinctively reaching out for a solid surface, finding only air. The floor was a muted linoleum, streaked with pale, sickly light from fixtures recessed high above. Doors, all identical, lined either side, their surfaces smooth and featureless. The air was cool, dry, and carried the faint metallic scent of something long stagnant. The quiet breathing of machines was a rhythmic, unnerving sound, a soft hiss and click that seemed to measure out the passage of an impossible time. There was no one. Not a single soul. This was not real. This was a trick. A poison whispered into the mind. This was the entity, striking back, trying to unravel my sanity before the true confrontation began. My uncle's warnings about its illusions, its mastery of fear, screamed in my head. Not real. I forced my eyes open. The hallway shimmered, wavered, then fractured. The linoleum dissolved into the polished brass of the lantern room floor. The sterile scent was ripped away by the bracing salt air. They pulsed, now less indistinct, taking on an almost predatory form. The confrontation had begun. The lighthouse was no longer just a structure. It was a cage, a weapon, a battleground. And I, Blake, the cynical architect, was its reluctant, terrified guardian, ready to wield a light that was never meant to shine. The final storm did not merely rage, it screamed. Within its maelstrom, I moved with a desperate purpose, my limbs heavy with exhaustion, my mind a frayed tapestry. It was the entity's breath, its true essence, manifesting beyond the tempest's veil. The glass of the lantern room groaned, not from the wind, but from a pressure that seemed to emanate from within the very air. Shadows, born from no discernible source, writhed in the periphery of my vision, elongating, twisting into grotesque parodies of human forms before dissolving. The sound of the storm, once a singular overwhelming force, began to fracture. They called to something deep within me, a primeval fear of utter solitude. I clutched my uncle's final journal, its leather binding slick with seawater and the sweat of my palms. My gaze darted from the frantic scrawl on its pages to the mechanisms of the lamp, my architect's mind racing, trying to overlay the esoteric warnings with the structural reality of the tower. He wrote of resonance, of focused light, of a harmonic frequency that could disrupt the entity's hold, a frequency tied to the lighthouse's original design, a secret known only to its first builder and, through his obsessive decoding, to my uncle. It was a language of angles and refractors, of specific rotational speeds and calibrated intensities, a battle plan etched in engineering. The very light of the lamp, usually a comforting, steady pulse, now seemed to flicker with an unnatural anxiety. They coalesced around the outer edge of the lantern room, a roiling, inky mass that absorbed the light, not reflecting it. My breath hitched. This was it. The full manifestation. A sudden jarring silence fell, not absolute, but profound, as if the storm had been muted, pushed to a distant, irrelevant hum. The low, rhythmic hiss-click of unseen devices pulsed from behind closed doors, a sound both monotonous and deeply unsettling. The air here was devoid of salt, of storm, of life. It smelled of antiseptic and something faintly metallic, like a forgotten instrument. Where were the walls of granite, the roaring sea? My mind reeled. Was this a trick, a fracture? It sought to isolate me completely, to sever my connection to the battle, to the light, to myself. No. I could still feel the tremor of the lighthouse beneath my feet, the faint metallic tang in my nostrils, the worn leather of the journal beneath my thumb. I reopened them. The dim hallway wavered, shimmering like a heat haze, but it persisted, a translucent veil over the reality of the lantern room. The entity was projecting this, weaving it into my perception. It wanted me lost. No. I rasped, my voice a raw, tearing sound in the illusory quiet. I slammed my fist against the journal page, forcing my eyes to focus on my uncle's frantic diagrams. The architectural knowledge, the precise measurements, the stress points. These were my anchors. The entity fed on isolation and fear, but also on the light itself, absorbing it, twisting it. My uncle's notes spoke of a reversal, of overcharging the entity's appetite, making it consume more than it could bear. I lunged for the lamp's controls, my fingers fumbling, yet driven by an instinct beyond conscious thought. It was an arcane override, a design flaw turned weapon. The rhythmic hiss-click of the phantom machines intensified, morphing into a suffocating presence. But I pushed back, my every fiber screaming defiance. I cranked the primary gear, feeling the resistance, the metal groaning under the strain. The lamp's rotation quickened, the beam a dizzying sweep across the storm-ravaged sea. Then, the secondary lever, stiff with disuse, yielded with a wrenching shriek. A hidden panel in the lamp's base slid open, revealing a series of smaller, crystalline lenses. I adjusted them, following my uncle's diagram, feeling the subtle shift in the light's focus. The air around me crackled. The storm outside seemed to recoil, its roar momentarily choked. The entity was fighting, its hold on my mind weakening as the light intensified. The lighthouse itself shuddered, not from the wind, but from the immense power coursing through its core. The beam, now a searing, blinding spear, pulsed with an unnatural brilliance, pushing back the encroaching night. I could feel the heat radiating from the lamp, a physical pressure against my face, against my very soul. My vision was swimming, my ears ringing with the combined shriek of the storm, the straining machinery, and something else. A high-pitched, inhuman keen that vibrated through my bones. I was pushing it, pushing the lighthouse, pushing myself to the absolute brink. The cost was immense, the outcome uncertain, but I would not yield. Not now. Not when the light was finally truly mine to command. The last thing I remembered was a final blinding flash, not of lightning, but of something tearing, something unmaking itself within the heart of the light. Then a silence deeper than any I had ever known, a void that swallowed the storm's fury whole. Now I lay, my eyes fluttered open to a world bleached of color, stripped of sound. The relentless roar of the ocean, the shrieking wind, the groaning timbers, all replaced by an unnatural hush. A faint, anemic glow spilled from recessed fixtures, painting the walls a sickly beige. My head throbbed with a dull, persistent ache, a counterpoint to the hollow echo in my chest. This was not the lighthouse. This was not the island. The air, thin and tasting faintly of antiseptic, felt alien after the salt-laced gales. My limbs were heavy, as if filled with sand, and when I tried to move, a dull protest rose from every joint. A thin, rough blanket covered me, smelling of detergent and disuse. My mind, a shattered mosaic, slowly began to reassemble. The storm, the entity, the final desperate act within the lens chamber. Had I won? Or had I merely survived? I remembered a scream that wasn't mine, a sound that seemed to rip the very fabric of the air, followed by an immediate, profound stillness. It was as if the world had held its breath, then slowly, tentatively, begun to exhale without the monstrous presence that had choked it. My gaze drifted down the length of the hallway. No footsteps, no voices, just the quiet, mechanical respiration. The entity, the shapeless horror that fed on light and isolation, had it truly been vanquished? Or had it merely retreated, leaving behind a husk, a broken vessel for me to inhabit? The thought was a splinter beneath my skin, an insidious suggestion that perhaps the victory had been a deception. Perhaps it had merely found a new prison, one made of flesh and bone. I pushed myself up, a groan catching in my throat. My muscles screamed in protest. My fingers, still raw and aching, traced the rough texture of the blanket. The hallway remained deserted. I felt a strange detachment, as if I were observing myself from a distance, a stranger in my own skin. Was this the aftermath? This numb exhaustion, this sterile confinement? My eyes scanned the bland walls, seeking some anchor, some proof of where I was, how I got here. There was nothing. No pictures, no signs, just the endless muted beige. It was a place designed for healing, perhaps, but it felt more like a waiting room for the forgotten. The light, once my enemy, now seemed a weak, flickering friend. The lighthouse. It called to me, a silent, insistent thrum beneath the quiet hum of the machines. My uncle's journals, filled with warnings and desperate pleas, flashed through my mind. He had known. He had fought. And I, Blake, had followed in his footsteps, not just into the tower, but into the very maw of the thing he had sought to contain. The decision, stark and unavoidable, coalesced in my mind. Abandon the island, flee the memory, try to rebuild a life untouched by the crushing weight of the deep. Or return. Return to the granite sentinel, to the wind-whipped cliffs, to the empty, echoing chambers. Return to stand guard. The entity had been defeated, yes. They lingered, like the scent of ozone after a lightning strike, a residue on the soul. I was changed. It was merely a temporary pause, a sterile interlude before the true reckoning. The choice was mine, a burden inherited from my uncle, etched into the very core of my being. I would go back. The thought solidified, cool and resolute. Not out of madness, not out of obsession, but out of a grim, terrible duty. The light needed a keeper, now more than ever. The scars would remain, a map of my ordeal, a constant reminder. But they would also be a shield. The quiet breathing of the machine seemed to concur, a slow, steady rhythm counting out the beats of my new, terrifying purpose.